Okay, so this week we're going to continue literally right where we left off, okay? And this is where we were. Last week we spent some time trying to figure out how we could create points and lives, right? We walk off the edge, we die, right? And then we respawn. We touch one of our cubes, which is automatically being instantiated through code, and we get a point, right? So we're registering all of this information, all these variables in the back end of our scripting system. But now we need to start really working with it. Let me just play the game in its current state. Okay, there's my little coin. If you look down in the bottom of our frame, it says number of lives. Yay, there it is. So we're registering the life value, the life variable that we created on our game controller script. If we were to walk off the edge of the map, what's going to happen? Does anyone remember? We're going to die, and then we're going to get respawned at a very specific location, which is in between the two cylinders. We touch that thing, we actually add a rigid body to it, and then we destroy it. I don't think in this version of the game that we've started to register points yet for our coins. So we'll plug that in here in a minute, and then we'll get started on how to wire in a whole, Mookie just dropped some stuff out of your pocket, by the way. We're going to start looking at how we can wire in some additional game objects, specifically UI, to read those variables, right? Because right now, exclusively, the bottom row of our console, or I guess what would be the first line of our console, which is showing up in the application frame, is the only method that we have as the game designer, or the player, if you will, to understand the current state of these variables, right? Naturally, when we build and export our game, this is not going to be an option for us. So we need to be able to communicate this data on screen through some UI. And this is actually, it takes some practice, because we now need to have scripts talking to each other and passing this information kind of like live on the spot, if you will, in a real-time capacity, so that the UI components are updated with the most recent, information. Okay. We're going to talk about two important ideas today. And these are really big picture programming ideas that really serve as the foundation for kind of the rest of our scripting work in this class. And one is called referencing, okay, which is the process of telling the computer, hey, go find something and reference just that one instance of this object, right? And then we're also going to talk about instancing a little bit. And instancing and referencing kind of go hand in hand. Now, when I say instancing, what I'm not saying is instantiation, right? What is instantiation? The creation of something. Instancing is when we have, like our coin, for example. Our coin is a game prefab, and then we generate an instance, a unique copy of that game prefab inside of the hierarchy upon the start of our game. Now, we could tell the computer to generate a whole bunch of these little coins. I can fill my little level here with 80 coins. How are we going to be able to pinpoint one of those coins very specifically when they're all named the same? That's the power of referencing and instancing, is that we can draw focus to a very specific copy of a prefab and reference the components on that copy. Someone once described it to me like this. And I think this works really well. You know, everything we need to know in life we learned in kindergarten. I'm a big believer in that, right? Kindergarten serves as such a wonderful analog to all the things that we go over, and especially when it comes to scripting. But you go to kindergarten. Now, my eldest son is in the first grade, so I have some recent experience with kindergarten. And we actually have this in our first grade class, too. Right? This whiteboard marker is, I'm going to do something that no teacher ever does, and that's throw away a whiteboard marker. There we go. Okay. So if you go into every class, and at times I had the crazy idea of doing it in this class as well, right? You go into any kindergarten or first grade class, of course what you're going to see is a whole series of cubbies, right? You guys remember cubbies? I love cubbies. The little little openings, right? They look like this. They kind of look like those IKEA shelves. Oftentimes, they are those IKEA shelves that are perfectly square. And then each child gets assigned a cubby, and they put all their junk in that cubby, right? Well, imagine that we're working off of something very, very similar to this, right? We have an infinite wall of cubbies, okay? And we are putting information in this, right? For us, we're going to be putting coins, okay? Or we could be putting UI elements. I'll just put UI, I made the U too big. There we go, UI elements into each cubby. Now, all of these coins could look the same, but these are all instances of one object, right? So how are we going to be able to go in and tell the computer to say, get that coin in that cubby? How are we going to be able to reference each one of these individually? That's what we're going to talk about today, is to get very specific, okay? So that we're not having to go in and hand code in which game object is responsible for doing X, Y, and Z. We ask the computer basically to find some conditions, and then it's going to start to pinpoint which of these little chunks of information that it's going to pull. Okay? Make sense? That's the big picture context of the day. Let's start off by kind of finishing up our work. I need to get a point system in here. We have our live system. It's working. I have my counter down here in my console rocking and rolling, so that's working quite lovely. But now we need to go in and just get our point system. So let's start firing open some scripts. And I'm going to start with our character controller script. And yes, boy, it sure does take a long, long time. Come on, Visual Studio, you can do it. I always feel in times like this that I need to have some sort of pre-made conversation. It's like Coffee Talk from Saturday Night Live, right? Welcome to Coffee Talk. Here's your conversation. Jumbo shrimp are neither shrimpy nor jumbo. Discuss, something like that. Huh?
That's pretty true.
It's pretty true, right? It's deep conversations that we have. All right, it's loading the solution. It'll be up here in a second. Oh, there's an update that I'm not going to do. All right, so what we need to add into our character controller script is some sort of new variable that starts to register points, right? Because every time we go pick up a coin, we need to generate a point, okay? So there's nothing in there at the moment that really starts to facilitate that. So we're going to physically go in and create a new variable. We're just going to start up here at the top because this is where we're declaring all of our public variables. So right now in this script, we have two variables, a Boolean that just is checking to see if whether or not we have touched that death zone, okay? And if the condition of the Boolean is true, we're going to respawn. If it's not true, well, we haven't died, so that's good, right? We also have another variable called lives. And that's just a number, an integer, that's determining how many lives are available to us. Next week, we'll start talking about maybe generating a win condition, right? So when we get down or a lose condition, at this point. When we have 0 lives, we'll reset the game. When we get like 6 points, we'll win the game, right? And we'll go on to the next level, right? We'll start talking about that next week because that'll give us a great opportunity to start plugging in some animation and sound effects into our game as well. All right, so let's go in and add one more variable here. I'm just going to copy and paste it. And this third one is going to be called points. Okay? Now, much like we did with both the Boolean, the dead Boolean, and the lives integer variable, we need to set this value at the very, very beginning of the game, right? Because all we're doing outside of the start function now, inside the actual class itself, in the script, if you will, is that we're just creating the variable. Well, we need to load some data into it. The computer's not going to load information until we tell it to, right? So what's the starting value for points? What would make sense? 0, yeah. So inside of my start function, as soon as the game starts, we're going to tell the computer to, hey, go grab the points variable and set it to 0. All right. So a couple things here. Let me just make sure they're on our way. Okay, so how are we going to register when a point is created? It's a good question, right? How are we going to do that? Let's think about the logic, because that's often the hardest part when doing any sort of computer programming, is to physically figure out, if you will, how all of this data is going to flow from one to another, right? Let's visualize it on the board, because this is actually a really good exercise, something that I do. Helps my little small brain figure out the data flow behind this. Now, I'm not going to think in code at the moment. I'm just going to think about structure, Goodbye, cubbies. Okay. So our character controller script is really becoming a central clearinghouse for a tremendous amount of information. And it makes sense that variables like lives, points, the condition or not whether you're dead, that all land on the character controller, right? That's a good home, right? So if here's our character controller, character, I'll just put control, oh, okay. Character controller, okay. Now what variables are living inside of my character controller at the moment? Let's see, we have dead, which is a Boolean. We have lives, which is a integer, a number. We also have points, okay? So let's create an input-output graph, if you will, for this entire system. What's going to feed this death zone? Or excuse me, this dead variable. I gave you the answer. The death zone, right? That's what's going to feed it, right? That's going to, so we're going to have another game object, death zone. It's going to output some information. So the out of the death zone is going to feed the in of the dead variable, right? What's going to feed lives? It's a good question, right? Maybe also the death zone, right? So two things are going to be coming from the death zone. This variable lives on the character controller, but really that information is being triggered somehow by the death zone. Okay? Now what's going to create points for us? The coins. Okay? So we have another object here. That makes sense to me. That's good logic. So the coins are going to send some information this way. Here, I'll put some arrows on here so you guys can understand it. Okay? So we're sending information from these two separate game objects over into our character controller. Okay? Now, all this stuff is coming in, but it's just sitting on a script. It's not actually going anywhere, doing anything at the moment, right? We need to have some sort of UI or some sort of output for all of this stuff that the player can interface with. Okay? So maybe we have some UI, a UI game object for lives, and then another UI for points. And then next week we'll do win-lose in animation. Okay, so this variable is going to get routed over here. And points is going to get routed over here. Okay, so we can already start to see the flow of information go through our little machine. This is like a central clearinghouse. The character controller just keeps the information, but it doesn't really do anything with it. These objects over here, which is the output of the entire clearinghouse of information, are the things that we're physically going to control. Yeah?
Would health react more like lives or like points?
I'm sorry, can you say the first part again?
So if you have like a health?
Health, yeah. So you can unhook it a little bit, right? Because it would, in structure, it would be the same. Right, it's just a number, right? It would be a number that would be a subset of the life, right? You have 100 life, then when you go down to 0, you lose a life. So it'd probably be a conditional statement against the.
Like, death would be within that?
Yeah, or could even be a separate object that controls all that jazz, right? You could keep dead here, but dead is going to be influenced maybe by another object, right? Maybe dead really isn't controlled by the death zone. It's just part of the equation. Yeah, exactly.
Your health is controlled, but then if your health says, oh, you reach 0 health, then it controls death.
Bingo.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just wanted to...
Yep. Yeah, and this is really a good place to begin when starting our entire construction of our machine, right? Just figuring out how all of this data is going to flow together, right? In every sense, we're just trying to figure out the logic of our machine first. And then we can go look at the computer code and start translating this over into something that's actually constructible, okay? As game designers, this is where we want to live, right? This is your responsibility as a game designer, is to figure out roughly how all these little bits of information are going to start to work together. You're not necessarily going to be tasked with creating the code. often you're going to hand something that looks similar to this, a data flow diagram, over to a programmer and say, okay, now make this work. Right? But today we're going to be programmers, and we're actually going to make this work a little bit and start plugging it together. Fail. All right, let's get back to work here. Okay, so we've already constructed some of the machinery that's required for death and lives. That's already working. But let's start looking at some new ways that we can start doing the point system for the coins themselves. Okay, excuse me, I apologize. Let's go back and... Okay, so I'm going to start. So we need to start working with this thing. We need to figure out a machine or some sort of method that's going to increase that value up by 1, right? So every time we touch a coin, we get a point, okay? Now, we already have a script and a little bit of machinery in place for our coin destroyer. Now, this may be a good spot to start adding some of this extra stuff in here, right? Because we're already registering a collision. We know that that interaction between the player controller and the coin is working. We've tested this, right? We saw this a second ago. We touched the coin, it falls to the ground, and then destroys itself after how many seconds? 3, okay? Maybe we also start to say, okay, now you can earn a point, okay? If you touch me, because we were already creating a condition with an if statement, if the thing that touches me is tagged with player, then do that. Well, it also makes sense that this is a good place to put that point, that add point value in, right? Now, sending information back and forth to between scripts can be complex at times. I want to show you a really easy way of doing it. What we're basically going to do here, and this is just one of 1,000 ways to do the exact same thing, by the way, okay? What we're going to do here is that we're going to broadcast a message. It's as if we're going to have the coin hold a bullhorn. And when the player touches it, we're going to say, add point. Okay, we're just going to scream. The coin is going to scream at the top of its lung, add point. Okay? And then we'll create a little listener, if you will, on the game controller, excuse me, on the character controller, that will be listening for that broadcasted message. And then when something says add point, what's it going to do? Add a point. Okay? It's a great way to broadcast things. Okay? And this can be easy, or it can be really powerful, but it also can get you into trouble because we're broadcasting it to the entire game. So if add point, if we have multiple game objects that are listening for add point, it could get you in trouble. It could get you in trouble. But in this case, I think it's going to work quite beautifully, right? Because we're only going to have one game object in our scene, the player, who's going to be listening for add point. Okay? It's also a great way to have one object send a message to like 80 different things, and 80 different things also, do the exact same thing, right? Like I've seen people do this on closing doors, right? If a condition's met, that object's broadcast closed doors, all the doors close in the game, right? Anything that's listening for that command will just do it, which is pretty cool. All right, so what we're going to do here is that we're going to send a message out into our world. But there's a couple things in here that we need to do first, okay? We need to reference and tell the coin where to send the message, or which object can receive the message. I think that's probably the better way of saying it, right? We need to tell we just can't broadcast the message out. We need to broadcast it and then also tell the computer, hey, this is the thing that can be listening for it, okay? So let's define what can listen to our game, or listen to the message by creating a new variable, okay? This is going to be a public variable, so let's just call this public, and it's, of course, going to be game object, okay? And then I'm going to call this my character controller. Oops, semicolon. There we go. Because my character controller, the actual character controller, because what I'm going to be accessing is this thing. Or more specifically, I'm going to be accessing that thing right there. Okay? Now, I'm not hard coding it in. I'm writing it generically so that we can load this information with some very specific data here in a second, right? So we're creating the reference to the game object that we want to control. We haven't told the computer which game object to control yet, so let's go ahead and start loading that stuff in. Like we've done in other examples. I want to copy this so I don't mess up. There we go. Once the game starts, we need to start loading some information into the variable that we created 2 lines above it, right? So my character controller, well, I don't want to go in and hard code it. I want the computer to go out and find my game controller, right? Now, I wanted to do game object, oops, excuse me, capital G, game object dot find, okay. Okay, there we go. So we're going out and we're saying, hey, find the game object inside of my entire scene that's tagged with player, right? It's a really great way of referencing a very specific object, okay? Those tags, oops, I forgot to do find with tag. Getting ahead of myself. Find with tag, there we go. I apologize. And the W in width, or width, is capitalized. There we go. Find with tag, player. All right, so we create a variable, we load the variable with a game object whose tag is player. That's all we've done so far, right? So now we've got to do something. Now that we've loaded the variable, let's go in and tell it to do something, or specifically down here. So if whatever touches the coin is tagged with player, we're going to add a rigid body, which is going to make it fall to the ground, and then it's going to destroy itself after 3 seconds. Let's also send a message, okay? So now we're going to do my character controller. Okay. Dot send message. Okay. Now we need to tell it what to broadcast. So we put it in parentheses, and specifically, I'm going to do add point. Okay. Now, what we include in the quotes here is going to actually be the name of a function on our character controller script. We haven't written that function yet, but now we're accessing a game object and a function inside the game object. We're basically just calling that function. We're saying activate add point, right? We're telling it to fire off a command right here under the add point section, right? It's an easy way of activating a function on a separate game object. All right, let's save my script. Go over to Unity, just really make sure there's no major problems. Yep, no compiler errors, which I'm very thankful for. But now we need to return back to our character controller script, okay? And we need to start doing that add point. We call it. Now we actually need to do something with it, right? So let's write a custom function. So void, whoops. Void add points. Add point, excuse me, singular. Add point. And open and close. Open and close. There we go. All right. So we've created a function. Let's just test to see if this function actually does something by throwing a little debug.log in there. And let's just say 1 point awarded. Ta-da! Okay. Let's save it. So if we've done this correctly, we should see in the bottom of our console 1 point awarded. Now I think I have another line of code in here that's kind of done. Yeah, I already have a debug.log earlier inside of my my game. So I'm just going to comment out that line of code. So now all we should see in the bottom of our console is that, if we've done this correctly.
That makes it stop working when you do the...
This right here?
Yeah.
So it's just not going to be evaluated. Yeah.
Oh.
It's a great way to keep something in there, but have the computer not actually just even look at that line of code.
The best way it was explained to me when I was in my programming classes is that's how you could add notes into your
Yeah.
script to allow people, so if anyone else was to go into it, they could see, you could write down specifically what the script or text below it is supposed to do if you're doing adjustments that way.
All right. Let's play the game, see what we get. There's my coin. Now we've been doing the points. Let's touch the coin. Boop. Yeah, mission accomplished. So we know it works. Okay. It says down there at the bottom, 1 point awarded. So our message was both sent from the coin and then received by my character controller script, and then some sort of action was produced. Rock and roll. That's what we're after, right? We've correctly referenced an object, a different object on a script, right? We're referencing the character controller script from inside the coin destroyer script, right? And that's pretty rad, okay? Because now we're having two things talk back and forth to each other very, very directly. Let's stop the game and return to Visual Studio. And now let's actually do something, right? Because we don't want to just do debug.log. We actually want to give ourselves a point, right? So now we need to physically go in and start changing the variable. Now our variable, our point variable, I think is just called points, if I remember correctly. Let's get rid of this. We don't need that anymore. Let's just triple check, make sure the variable is called points. Yeah, it's called points. I'm going to copy it. And then what are we going to do here? We could do that. We could do that. That's a good way of working. Okay. Here's another way of working. Okay. Some people prefer it this way because it's a little bit more explicit, if you will. Points. Okay. The variable points, when we hit the coin, or when add point is called, we're going to take the current state of points and then simply, add 1. Okay? We were doing this last week for our lives. That's cool too, right? This is just another way of writing it. It's a little bit more explicit. The current state of points plus 1. Okay. All right, let's save the script, go back over into Unity, and there's nothing in here at the moment that's telling us the current state of all of our points. So let's do that real fast. All right. Now there's a reason I didn't delete that debug.log earlier, right? Because let's test to see if this crazy system is in fact working, okay? Because now, number of lives, let's not test that. Let's see if points, okay? Number of points, that makes sense. So now we're going to write down into the console number of lives, and then we're going to ask against the current state of the variable, the points variable. Now we only have 1 coin at the moment. Let's save our script. So when we touch the coin, it's compiling. There we go. Number of points, see how it says 0? Yeah, great. That's perfect, right? When we started the game, we set the variable to 0, okay? What do you think, what should happen when I touch the coin? Plus 1, right? Let's go over, touch it, bloop. Now, why did it go to 2? I touched it twice. Yeah, I touched it twice. So we do have some problems in here, some bugs that we need to resolve. That rigid body that we're adding to make the coin drop, maybe we need to engineer a different solution. Okay, maybe we just take out the rigid body because once it falls, it now becomes something that we can continue to touch over and over and over again, right? I think that's probably the simple solution for today. Let's go back over into our coin destroyer script, and I'm just going to delete that line of code. And I'm not going to have it, let's delete it after 1 second. There we go. Save it back to Unity. Let's play the game, see what we get now. It won't be as much fun. Bloop. There we go. So it works. We touch the coin, we get a point, and then it disappears. Okay. Mission accomplished, right? Now we're talking. So in every sense, both of our variables are currently working, right? We're registering the number of lives, and we're registering the increase of some points. But the challenge that's now at our doorstep is figuring out how to wire in some UI to communicate all of those, the state of all of these variables to our player, right? Because they only exist in our console, which naturally we are the only ones that are going to see as the developers, right? So we need to get it out into maybe some UI elements on screen that our player can see. This is where it gets fun, because now we're going to have 3 things in the mix, right? At the moment, we only have 2. We only have the character controller script and then the coin destroyer script. Now we're going to add in a 3rd script, and I'm going to call this one the game controller, okay? And the game controller is going to be responsible for driving a lot of the global game properties like UI, okay? So let's start that whole process now, adding in a 3rd one. All right, now earlier we had this script warehouse, and I think this is actually a pretty good idea. We're going to change it now since it's doing more than just creating a coin. This one game object is going to be responsible for generating some game assets for us and to communicating some big time structural components to our gamer. So let's change the name of this, and I'm physically going to call this, game controller. Okay. It's not a player controller or a character controller. Now we're having scripts and functionality that's going to influence the entire game. Okay. So inside the game controller game object, we're going to add a couple scripts. Okay. Well, specifically, we're going to add one. So let's write the first script. And I'm going to call this, I think just for today, to keep it really, really simple, we'll call this text controller, or we'll do UI or GUI, GUI controller. So as one might imagine, this one script is going to be responsible for creating the on-screen graphics for our player. Okay, this script, since it's going to be a global system, is going to be associated with our game controller over in our hierarchy. That guy right there. And I like to put it on there pretty soon, just to ensure that it gets attached to an existing game object. I can't tell you how many times I've done that. I've run a script, or I've written a script, and then I'll play the game, and I'll go, why is this not working? Nothing is working. And then after like 30 minutes of like smashing my head and banging on the keyboard, I go, oh yeah, I didn't actually put the script on an active game object. Yeah, that burns, because then you get all upset for nothing, because it's just like a stupid human error, right? Okay, let's go and start writing some work, or doing some work and writing some code on our GUI controller. Okay, I'm just going to change this a little bit, just so it's a little bit more clean. Okay, so now what we're going to be doing here is a couple different things. We need to write a script, and we need to create a system that allows us to access some GUI elements and then to feed data into those GUI elements, right? If you go back to our little diagram here, you can just barely see it under the whiteboard, okay? These are the 2 GUI elements. We need to have some text that displays the on-screen, number of lives that we have, and also same thing, an on-screen version for points. Let's create those game objects over inside of Unity and start getting those game objects created. So we'll say goodbye to Visual Studio just for a second and swap back over into Unity. All right, so let's do this. We've done this a couple times before, so let's just do it again, UI. And we're just going to use some simple text, okay? Very simple. We're going to keep it pretty basic today, all right? Now, let's get specific here, okay? This is going to be, let's do lives counter, okay? This one's going to count the lives. And if you look very, very carefully at all of its rec transform, look where Unity placed this object inside the scene itself. Put it way down in kind of the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Well, we don't want it to do that. We don't want to manually place things. And this is something that some of you guys were kind of banging your heads against earlier, right? I'm just going to change the color to white. You can just barely see it way down over there, okay? Now, the problem with manually positioning all of your UI elements inside the canvas is what? Does anyone remember this? Yeah, you're probably, some people, Indigo can even see it because hers is off screen, right? Yeah, when you size and scale the your game window, the on-screen text is going to change its location. It's not pinned to anything. Okay, it's just floating at a defined location in space, but that space, this is a numerical position. It is, and numerically it is that location, right? But what if we're trying to create an interface for an iPhone screen and an iPad screen and a computer desktop screen? I don't want to have to go in and numerically hard code in all of those values, right? I want to create a system that allows me just to kind of generally pin it to the boundaries of the frame and then go from there, right? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to reset the location of all that, okay? Oops, I don't know why. There he goes. Now it's in the middle. Let's increase the font size a little bit. So big. My canvas is huge. There it is. Okay. Oops. Sorry, I was on the wrong side. Now, you can see that new text is kind of being truncated into 2 rows here. So I want to make this a little bit bigger, the bounding box, if you will. This tool in here allows me to change the area in which my text can appear. I know that this is just going to say, this is my life counter, so maybe I'll just have lives, colon, and then the number of the variable. So it doesn't need to be anything super, super big. There we go. I like it. All right. So let me make sure, reset this again. Oh, sorry. Didn't mean to do that. But I do want that back at 0, 0, 0. Okay, the width and the height was basically what I was adjusting with my rect transform tool, changing the bounding box. When I hit reset, it reset the width and the height as well, which I want to preserve. So now with the position for our button at 0, 0, 0, we're going to use this thing, which is going to pin this item very directly to a specific location inside of the scene. You click on it, you get this little bit of information. This little bit of, we can start pinning these to wherever we want. But we want to anchor it, okay? So if you hold down the Shift key, you'll set the pivot point. But we also want to set the position of this, right? So there's really kind of 3 things that we're trying to establish and trying to anchor. The anchor point, the pivot point, which is going to determine where that kind of like a little crosshair thing is going to show up, and then also the position inside the frame itself. So if you hold down the Alt and the Shift key at the same time, you're basically doing all 3 at once, which is kind of what we're after. It makes it very, very easy. See how it changes? And I want to have this guy pinned and positioned inside the upper left-hand corner. All right, and there it is. It's just wonderfully docked. Let's test it real fast. Does it stay docked? Yep. Now it's always in that upper left-hand corner, right? Aha, awesome. It kind of looks a little too kind of nudged up in that corner, right? When you're designing things for a television screen, there's what's called an overscan for the image itself. It's not as apparent anymore on the age of these big LCD TVs, right? Point being, the image actually extends into the bezel of your television ever so slightly. It used to be like an inch on the old school like glass front CRT monitors. Now it's a couple millimeters. Point being, we probably don't want to have our text perfectly in the corner there, right? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to my inspector on my UI element, and I'm simply going to change its position ever so slightly. Okay? I'm going to push it in to the center, 10 pixels on the X, and then down 10 on the Y. And now, now it's just kind of hanging out. Get a little bit of a margin here and a little bit more of a margin there.
Is there a way to drag that without having to put in the numbers?
I mean, you could. You could do it manually this way. I mean, there's nothing that says that you can't, right? It's just updating the position. So you certainly could. Yeah. Oh, another thing. Some folks forget this, but these labels are actually sliders, too, in your inspector. So that's another great way of getting in and working. So instead of manually entering it in, you just left-click and drag on the title of the field, and it will do it as well. All right. That's good enough for me. And let's test it once again. Yep. Just generally keeping that margin, which is what I'm after. Okay, I'm happy with that. Okay, now we got it pinned. It's not going to go anywhere. Let's continue on with our journey. Okay, so with my lives counter UI element selected, I'm going to just put in some default text in here. Okay, let's just put lives text. That's what I'm going to leave it. Oops, I forgot to hit. There we go. I hit escape on accident. And it didn't. There we go. Lives text. You could even put, if this is lives counter. Oh, that's interesting. You know why? Check it out. It says lives counter here. If you look very carefully on the screen, what's missing? The R. Why is it missing the R? Yeah, the bounding box for that object is a little too small, but we can change it, luckily. This up here determines the width and the height. Let's just make it a little bit bigger. There it is. You can see it updating in here. So what we're adjusting is that light gray outline around our UI. All right. So now what we need to go in and do is start feeding information into that text. I don't want to do it with code, right? Or I don't want to do it manually. I need that counter to be a live representation of the number of lives that I currently have in the game, right? And the only way that we can do this is with code, right? And we're going to use this power of referencing and instancing that we were talking about earlier to continue to drive this action, okay? We're going to do this basically twice. Once for our counter, our lives counter, and then another one for our point counter, okay? Let's go back over into Visual Studio and start wiring together this entire little bit of mechanism. So I'm in my GUI controller script, okay? And let's start plugging some things together. Now, there's a couple things in here that we need to create initially. One of the things that we need to do is that we need to create some sort of reference to the game object that we're looking for, right? Because we want to control, if you will, we need to control that thing right there, okay? So we got to go find that in code. We also have to go find this with code, okay? Or specifically, we need to go find the character controller script because that has the variable that we need to access, okay? So there's a couple things in here that we need to reference in order for all of this to work together quite wonderfully, okay? First and foremost, let's start accessing our UI component. Let's get that to work perfectly first, and then we'll start adding some new layers on top of that. So as one might imagine, we have to create some sort of variable that we now can start loading information into. So we're going to create a public variable, and I'm going to call this one just my, oops, not MUI, my lives counter, okay? And I forgot to give it a type. I'm sorry for that. This is of type text, okay? Not texture. Text. My lives counter, okay? Now, when we have text in here, we're accessing the UI engine. Notice that it doesn't go blue, okay? And I did this intentionally because I want you guys to see something that you're going to run into. Now, if I did public int, like this, a number, just call this the variable name number, okay? Check it out. Oh, I'm sorry, I said blue, I meant green. See how Unity or Visual Studio understands that that's a variable? Okay? We need to make sure that, that it knows this, it understands this data type. Okay? The library, the namespace that we're using right now understands that int means a number. Right now, currently, it doesn't understand that we're trying to add and access a text game object inside of our scene, right? This is unknown to it, so we actually need to load in a namespace library. We actually did this, I think, last week. So whenever we're working against or with UI stuff, we need to load in the Unity UI engine. Using Unity.engine, or Unity engine, I'm sorry, .ui. With that namespace library loaded into the script, it's going to understand the importance of text. And now it went blue because I clicked on it, or I clicked off of that line of code. And now it goes, oh, I understand. I get this. The text, you're accessing the text game component of a game object called my lives counter. Okay? All right. So we've created, now we can get rid of this thing. That was just an example. All right. So we've created a variable called my lives counter, and we've data typed it to the text game object, right? Because keep in mind, as a reminder, what we're trying to do here is that we're trying to find this game object, and specifically this game component, okay? when we created this game object, how did we create it? Does anyone remember? This is going to help you understand the reasoning behind this entire structure. When we created this UI object, we actually created a text object. Okay? Not a game object, a text object. Okay? So in code, what we're accessing here, and I apologize for being crazy zoomed in, we're accessing that exact same text object. Okay? We're saying this is a UI text game object. Okay? Data typing. So my lives counter is only ever going to be known to the scripting as a text game object. Okay? All right. So we create the variable. Now we've got to put some data into it, right? This is a container. Let's fill the container the moment the game starts. So I'm going to copy my lives counter here. Command C, Command V. And let's set it. The moment the game starts, we need to load some information into it. Okay? Now we need to go, the moment the game starts, just like we did earlier with the other example for our coin, the moment the game starts, we need to load this bucket with some information. We need to load it with game object text information. Okay? So we need to go find a game object. Game object dot find. Now ours is called, we have to be very specific here. Ours is called lives counter. So we want to go find this guy. Okay? Lives counter. And then, not only do we want to find the game object itself, so we're finding lives counter, but now we want to grab the text component. And this is confusing, and I get it. I really do, because we have two things that are named text. I get it, right? We have an object who is a text object, right? The bucket, okay? The global bucket for all of our on-screen UI. This is the text object whose name just happens to be lives counter, right? And then we have a text component, okay? And the component is physically responsible for filling the string characters into that game object. Does that make sense? So we have a game object that's called text, and then we have a text component inside that game object, okay? All right. So now now that we found the text game object here, I want to go get the text component so I can start physically adding custom information into it, right? So now we're going to do get component. Now get component has some interesting syntax that we need to ensure follows. Open and closed carets. And then at the very end, this is the one that I always forget, the open and close parentheses. Okay. Now, the one that we need to be very mindful of is what's inside the open and close carets. Okay? Now, the one that we want to get, does anyone want to take a guess what component we're going to try to register and go access? The text. You got it. Okay? Awesome. I just want to make sure I had a semicolon back there. So when the game starts, we're going to fill this word with a text game object that's called lives counter, and then we're also going to get the game component, the text game component. Okay? All right. Now let's test it. Let's see if this works. Okay? I want to see if I'm actually doing what I'm trying to do here, and I think this is an important idea to continue to practice as you write the script. Okay? Because this is going to be a pretty lengthy script. We're going to have a lot of fracture points. Let's ensure that at least this works before we go on. Okay? That way, when we're debugging something and trying to figure out where the fault points are, we'll know a little bit more accurately where to look. Okay? So we test as we go to make sure that to make sure that it's working, right? So here's how I'm going to test it out. After we load the variable with some information, let's set the variable. Okay? I want to make sure I'm doing this right. So let's just do my lives counter. My lives.text. Okay? Because now we're actually loading information into that text component. We got it here. Now we're physically setting that here. Okay? We're going from a big description of the game object to the component that sits on it. Okay? And let's just do, oh, I don't know. Let's be silly. I control you. Okay. Let's see if that works. So if it shows up as I control you, we've done it, right? Because that's something that I wrote in code. Let's save the script, go back over into Unity. If we've done our job, this should immediately change. Okay? It shouldn't say lives counter anymore. What should it say? I control you. Let's do it. Mission accomplished. Okay? So now we have 3 things that are working together, right? 3. We have our game controller, our player controller. We haven't wired in the player controller yet. But we have the game controller and the GUI controller all talking to each other, passing this information to a very specific game object. Okay, let's stop the game. Now, we've proven to ourselves that we're doing it, okay? But we don't want to necessarily do that at start, okay? What we really want to do is that we want to start doing this every frame of the game, okay? And I don't want it to say, I control you. This is lives, so we'll do lives, colon. But now we need to start going in and accessing the variable, right? The lives variable. Does anyone remember off the top of your head where that lives variable is stored? On our character controller, right? So now we need to reference the game object that houses that script, right? Much like we were referencing the coin stuff earlier, right? So we got to tell the computer which game object the script lives on, and then get that script, okay? Kind of like what we were doing here. We're doing it internally here, but we're going to do it externally here in a second. We're saying, hey, go find a game object, and then get the component that's on that game object. Now, when it comes to a script, we're not going to say get component.txt, okay? We're actually going to say go get the name of the script, okay? And then we'll be able to access the contents of that script, okay? All right. So we've got to do 2 things. We've got to reference the game object and then reference the script, okay? In order for this whole thing to work. So let's just go ahead and do it real fast. We're going to do it up at the top of the screen. Okay, so we'll do public game object, and we'll just call this the player, right? Because the player, so this thing right here, I want to get that game object, and specifically this character controller here, right? That's the script that I'm after, because look, there it is. There's my lives counter just chilling on that script. I want to go in and programmatically access that variable so that it can be printed into the GUI, okay? Let's go back to Visual Studio and start doing it. We've created the variable. Well, now we've got to start loading in some information into that variable, right? Much like we did here. So our player, we're going to load it. Let's load data into the variable, okay? I'm a big fan of this game object. Oops, sorry. Game object dot find with tag. What's the tag going to be? Player. You got it. All right, so there is the reference to the game object, okay? Now the next thing that we need to do, and I'm going to, so this is the game, this is in every sense, we've snagged that and we've loaded it into the word the player, okay? Now what we need to do is that we need to go get the script, okay? And this is where it gets kind of funky. Okay, so we're going to do another variable. Okay, and so now we need to go in and make a custom variable for a script that is not really data typed as a script. We're kind of making our own variable in this moment, but this own variable is going to have meaning based on the association with its parent. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I think once you see it, you'll go, oh, I get it. Okay, so this is the data type, okay, and the name, we're just going to have a capital C, character controller, okay. Now, why am I saying character controller? Well, what we are accessing here, and we can actually see it here in Visual Studio, we're getting this now. You know another way of doing it, and this may be a little bit easier. My character controller. Okay, that's the name of the variable. So what we're looking for is that we're saying this is that script right there. Okay, and we're giving it a special name. Its own instance name called my character controller. That way we can access it very directly. Okay. So here's the script, or the instance of the script. Let's give it some value. Let's load its information. So now we need to tell it where it lives. Okay. Well, it lives on the player, right? That's this thing. We already loaded the player with some info here. So the player dot get component, open and close carets, open and close curly braces or parentheses, excuse me. And now the excuse me, the component that we're going to get is the actual script name itself, which just happens to be there. Okay. So let's talk through the logic, and this is the part that's strange. When we're trying to get a component, an existing component like a renderer, a transform, that stuff is wicked easy because it's titled very, very cleanly inside the inspector. We're not accessing a defined kind of standard, if you will, component type. Okay, we're accessing a custom one that we wrote and one that we named. Okay, let's jump back over into Unity and start looking at how this is working. Okay. So we're getting this game object right here. Here, you know what? Maybe a better way of visualizing this. Whoops. Oh, this is working so well. There we go. Okay. All right. So we are getting this game object, and we're saving the reference to that game object inside of a variable called the player, right? Because if you think about it, the rigid body first-person controller, that is the player, right? So we're saving the reference to that game object in just a fancy word that we're calling the player. It could be Pat's awesome player for all we care. It's just a word, right? It's just a word, okay? We give that word meaning by its reference, this thing, okay? So we snag the reference to that game object, and we save it into the player, right? Well, now we need to go grab this component, right? And this is a script. This is something that we wrote. It's not one of the defined components that comes with all game object, right? This is a custom one that we made, right? And that we assigned to just this one instance of this object, okay? So it's called character controller. It's a script, okay? And that's what we're doing here, okay? Here's the reference to the player. Now we're creating a reference to the script component itself, okay? So the component type is called character controller, and it has to be called character controller to match the name of the component, which is the script's name. Does that make sense? Adrian's like, what? I don't think I understand this, okay? So the name of the component is the name of the script, okay? If we compare this to what we were doing earlier, okay, here's a great example right here. See how we're saying get component, text, the text component, right? That's a really easy thing to see inside of Unity, right? Because we can go, here's the game object, and then here, look how it's written. Text. We're getting this component, and then we're accessing all of its internal kind of machinery, okay? Well, when we have a script that lives outside of the naming structure, if you will, of the Unity kind of game object system, okay, we have to create basically our own component who matches the name of the script in order to access the contents of the script, okay? And that's what we're doing over here. This is the name of the script. It's also the type of component we're accessing, okay? These are types of variables. These are data types. Oops, what did I just do? These are data types. We give that data type a unique name, and then we load that data type uniqueness with some information. This is the data type, which is the actual name of the script. We give it uniqueness inside the system by giving it its own unique variable name, and then we load that variable with the actual script itself. So think of this as the script name. Okay, this is the name of the script. These two things. Make sense?
Yeah, it's just wild to me, like, whenever you look at things in the UI, like, especially with the life counter, you assume that it's one of the more simple
Nope.
aspects.
And then you're like, oh my God. It actually goes into it, right? Yeah. Welcome to programming. Everything requires about a dozen lines of code just to make it work, right?
I had the wrong idea about, like, what took the longest time in programming stuff.
Everything takes a long time in programming.
Yeah, okay.
There's no easy things, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like halfway there.
Okay.
I understand the part about you putting the script, you naming the script, and then you taking the name of the script to make it so you can access it later.
Yep.
I think the part I'm probably confused about is when you take the when you make the script special by giving it the name my character controller, is that just so you can access it without having to completely type it out?
Absolutely, yeah, because otherwise we'd have to type out. If we wanted to access the contents of the script, we'd have to go find it first, and then we'd have to say, blah, blah, get all this jazz, right? We're saving that entire huge line of code into one word. Yeah. And sometimes people get really, really truncated with their naming conventions. I'm making all of this stuff as clear as I can. If you've looked around, the Unity sphere a little bit and started looking at code samples that other programmers have made, they'll do like something like that, right? That'll be the name of their variable, CC, and they'll know because this is their personal right. Oh, CC, that's the character controller. Yeah, and they'll do like, yeah. It did. It's trying. So this is what a lot of folks will do. They'll make it really simple, right? That way, when they're continuing their journey here, they'll type cc dot whatever, and they're on their way accessing the contents of the script. So we can make this real abbreviated and truncated pretty quickly. Other questions on this idea? So at this point, all we've done is we just referenced the game objects and the game components that we need to start funneling this information into our GUI counters, right? So let's actually start that process now. Okay. Okay, so now that we've referenced all of the correct objects, we can start accessing them, right? Because we have to load them into the script, or load their location, if you will, into the script first before we can do anything with them. Think of this kind of like the loading screens on your games, right? In order to play the game and to get access to all the wonderful experiences inside the game, the program has to load, right? All that information has to be stored into memory. It's kind of what we're doing here, right? It's almost exactly, you go back to the cubby idea that we were talking about at the beginning of class, right? We've told the computer which cubby to look at very directly. And now we're grabbing the backpack that's in the cubby, right? We're grabbing the little binder that's in the cubby, and we're opening it up, and we're actually reading the stuff that's inside the binder, okay? So now we can do something with it. And this is what we're going to do down here in the update function. So the counter that we were working with before, this is the string that we're going to load in, but now we're going to start loading in some of those variables, okay? Does anyone want to take a guess at how we're going to write this?
Plus, y.
Okay, I like it. Well, we're not going to add anything. We're just reading now, right? The character controller is the script that's responsible for adding the numbers, right? To increasing the integer for our lives counter, right? We're just reading that information now. We want to access it.
We're going to tell it to find the
Okay, I like it. So we need to get to that lives variable, right? Where does that lives variable live? Bingo. You got it. So now we go let's see. I'm going to copy and paste it just to make sure. My character controller. Okay. So now we've accessed the actual script now, right? Because remember, that's what we're doing here. We're accessing the script. We're saving it into my character controller. We've already got the component, right? The lives is actually a variable inside of the script, right? So we don't need to get the component. The component's actually the script, which we've already gotten in line 16. Okay. So now what we need to do, we get the script, which is called my character controller dot lives. Okay. Now we're going to be loading this into a UI system, right? The UI system doesn't understand, it only understands letters and numbers, okay? Well, let me put that more, that can be confusing. It only understands characters, okay? String characters, okay? So what we need to do is that we need to change a number, because that's what lives is. It's an integer, it's just a number. We need to change it into a character that can be written by the UI system. So the final part in this is to string. Okay, because then it will turn into a character that the text component can write and physically create. It's kind of strange to think of it like that way, but it's just how it works, right? All right, should we see if it works? Yeah? Oh, I forgot one thing. I went off notes for a second. We have to have open and close parentheses there. I apologize. Save it, return to Unity. Unexpected symbol, my character controller. So I went wrong somewhere. Then I make a change, and this always happens. If you're in my class on Wednesday, okay, make sure we got it all. Yep.
So it won't always tell you if something's written wrong then.
Yeah, well, it's not always going to tell you exactly what's written wrong. It says unexpected symbol on this line. Maybe I just goofed somewhere. Oh, this is so easy, it's hard. What did I forget here? Does anyone want to take a guess? A plus sign. Yeah, because we're taking this string, this in here, lives. I forgot to do the plus sign. My bad. Plus. Okay, so we're writing. This is what I write in here with code, and then we're going to add in the current state of the variable. I forgot to do the plus sign. It's Friday afternoon. My brain hurts. It's compiling. It's compiling. Yay! My error at the bottom of the frame goes away. I always get a little anxious, a little anxiety when I'm compiling. It's like, please let it work, please let it work, please let it work. No errors. Yes, no errors, right? Okay, let's play the game, see if it works. What should we expect to see? Yeah, so this should say lives, colon, and the number in the current state of the lives variable, right? We'll find out. Yeah, we'll find out. If something's getting cut off, we'll know pretty easily. We'll know pretty instantly. Excuse me. Let's play the game. Boom. Okay, rock and roll. It works. Now we're pulling the correct variable. We're controlling that UI. Let's destroy ourselves by jumping off. Works. Jump off again. We hit the def zone. Mission accomplished. Okay. Now let's do it one more time for our points counter, okay? Same concept, almost identical concept than what we had before. So we need to have a UI element that's going to be the output for all of this. We already have the variables being stored on the character controller, and we already have the input for that container already created as well. The coin is the input for that entire, you can just barely see it here. The coin is the input. It adds points, okay? This is where the points are actually stored in the character controller script, and then we just need to send that information over into a new UI game object to get it all working. So let's start off by adding the UI game object. Create UI, it'll just be another text element. Points counter. Let's position it where we want it to go. Let's see, this one was pretty big, 40. I'll make that one 42. We'll need to change oops. There we go. Ah, that drives me crazy. Hitting the escape key clears it. Points, counter. There we go. And let's look at our scene view, because it's just a little too small. There it is. Now, I want my points counter to be on the right side of my interface. Okay? So what should I do over here? If I want it to be on the screen right side, kind of in the right upper right corner, what's the first thing I should do? And let me bring the game view back up. Going to pin it first, okay? And then we'll want to align the actual text inside the container to the right. So we'll pin it first. Upper right, I'm holding Shift and Alt down right now. Upper right. There it goes, but that's not exactly where I want it, right? And that has everything to do, look, the container, I know it's hard to see against that background. The container is pinned where I want it to go, but the text inside the container is not where we want it. So we have to do some just simple paragraph alignment down in the text properties. All of this jazz. There we go. I'll even, yeah, that's fine. Ta-da! We'll do the exact same thing that we did earlier. We'll do, what, -10. And, or what was the other one? I've forgotten the values. Negative, I'll copy that. Put a negative sign there. There we go. And then it was -10 this way. All right. Okay, we got it set up. Let's go back into code here and getting this to work, because now we need to basically do the exact same thing again, right? I want to show you something that's pretty cool. All right, so I'm going to copy this, and I'm just going to group them, and this is just me being me. Okay. I'm kind of OCD when it comes to stuff like this. I like to have all of my common variables kind of grouped to each other. It just makes it really easy for me to consume the script, but admittedly, that's just crazy Pat talking. You can do it however you want, right? Doesn't matter which order. So I got my lives counter, my points counter. We don't need to add in another reference to the player because we're already doing it the way we want. Now we need to load in this entire thing again, okay? But we don't want to find a game object that's called lives counter. We want to find a game object called points counter, right? That's the UI element that we just created, points counter. And then, of course, we want to access its text component, just like we did on the other counter. So let's change this, my points counter. Oops, too many I's. There we go. All right. So we've created the variable. We've loaded the variable. Now we've got to do something down here with the variable itself. And it's going to be wholesale identical to this whole thing, right? So I'm going to copy it, paste it in. Of course, this is not going to be lives counter. This will be my points counter.text, points. We'll access the points variable, and life is good. Let's go back over into Unity and see if it works. Do we get any compile errors? Nope. Let's play the game. Nice. Rock and roll. Proof is always in the pudding, right? Let's go in and touch the coin, see what we get. Yoink, and then it destroys itself. Mission accomplished. Okay. Pretty amazing, huh? Pretty amazing. Now with this system in tow, we now have a a feedback loop for our player, right? We've created some machinery and we've provided them with an opportunity to see the outcomes of what that machine is producing, right? We've gone through our entire data flow and we've created a system that's instanced and referenced correctly. And I want to show you one other thing here that's kind of a nice representation. Let's go to our game controller. Okay? And this is really what we're after, because this is good visualization that we've done our job correctly. Okay? So I have my game controller game object selected, and of course over here inside of our components we can see the GUI controller script live. Okay? Now you see where all these slots in here, my lives counter, my points counter to the player, my character controller. What are those? You got it. These are containers. These are the variables that I created on that script. Okay? Let me show you specifically. Let's go back to the GUI controller script in Visual Studio. So I'm in GUI controller, and I need to scroll to the left. There we go. Okay. Check it out. See how those those four variables are classified as public? Okay. When we have a public variable, it's always going to show up in the inspector, okay, as an area in which someone can load some information into, right? But oftentimes, we don't want to have to go in by hand and load information, especially in an environment that's as dynamic as this, okay? That would take forever. And it's going to get sloppy, and wires are absolutely going to get crossed, mistakes are going to be made, and things are fundamentally going to get broken just by human error. Right? So when all of our variables are public, they're going to show up in the inspector as they are over here. Now watch what happens. Since they're public and since they're showing up in the inspector, watch what happens when I start the game. I'm just going to do Command P. And this is always a really great visual confirmation that you've done your job, that you're actually accessing things and loading things in. Cool, huh? I always feel good when that happens. Like, hey, I'm actually getting what I wanted to get, right? And if you look at the icons, the names of the icons, they're actually getting the game objects, and specifically, look, even says, I know we're zoomed in, but this little C# logo, right? We're actually getting the script that we're after, so it works, right? I like to have these things available to me when I'm prototyping and creating my scripts, because it's just a nice visual reinforcer that I've done my job. High five, Pat. Okay, but having them out in the open here can actually get in the way a little bit, okay? It's nice to see that good visualization that you're loading things in correctly, but it's good practice at the end of the day to make all of those private so they're not available in the inspector. They're still going to be available within the context of the script itself, but they're not going to be seen inside the inspector. It certainly doesn't hurt to have them out there. It really doesn't, but, you know, let me just show you what it looks like. So private instead of public. I'm going to copy, paste, paste, save the script, go back into Unity, okay? Now, once it compiles, oof, okay? All that stuff is now stripped away. We don't have public access to it anymore. But if we play the game, we still get what we're after. It still works, okay? So keep things public until you're really sure. Okay, and then make them private. If they don't need to be in the inspector, they don't need to be in the inspector. Yeah, that's just kind of it's like a pothole in a road, right? Someone's going to drive into it and break their axle eventually, right? It's just kind of danger, danger. Pretty neato, huh? So with this completed, we've now referenced a whole bunch of different stuff. We've referenced game objects, and we've referenced components within the game objects, and we've referenced custom game components, scripts, okay? 3 things that you're going to be doing all the time in code, or at the very least as game designers, you should be aware of what they're doing, right? You should be aware of their function, okay? Because this is kind of like the bread and butter stuff when it comes to programming. Okay, I'm going to go get this script. Specifically, I'm going to access a variable in the script, and I'm going to change it, or I want to read that variable and print it out onto a GUI element, okay? We're going to be doing a lot of this going forward, okay? Especially given the context of the next step, which is to get animation into this whole thing. Because when we talk about adding animation into our game, Now we're going to have to start accessing some very specific game objects and specifically the game components on those game objects to ensure that the right animation clip or the right animation state is going to be activated with code. Cool, huh? Yeah? Good? You guys feeling it? Yeah? All right. Start practicing this for your game, for your level. You should be at a point now that the art assets are done, that we can start transitioning over into infusing some of these feedback loops inside of our games. All games need to produce some sort of information back to the player that reminds them and keeps them in the loop as to the current conditions of the game and their placement within inside the game experience, right? So you're going to want to use this all over the place, okay? At the very least, just being able to programmatically influence the GUI elements is a good place to begin. All right? Let's take a break. We've been going for 2 hours. Let's just take a small little break.